talk.
Greetings and salutations. Today, Hawk Watchers, let's take a moment to reflect. Let's break out our history books and look back on the last 100 years of the United States of America. What defines the nation's last 100 years? Was it our technological breakthroughs like walking on the moon or the invention of the first two-stroke kerosene engine? Was it our role in World War II, the birth of the middle class in the 1950s and the revolutionary 1960s? Was it the rise of the military-industrial complex, or the development of nuclear power and ultimately the most devastating weapon known to man? And as we look back upon the past, we must also look forward to our future, because quite obviously what is past is prologue. So what does the future hold for a U.S. economy whose lifeblood still runs on fossil fuels, the service industry, and the almighty war machine? My fellow Hawk Watcher Sean Stone has spent the last year navigating our past to better predict our future in his upcoming documentary, A Century of War, which will air in 4 parts starting on November 15th. Sean set out to discover what happened to the dreams of being that shining city on the hill, and to find out just what the future holds for the great American dream. So let us delve in to this century of war as we begin watching the Hawks.
If you want to know what's going on in your city and your streets, never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world? Watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks, watching the Hawks. Listen when they talk.
Welcome everyone to Watching the Hawks. I am Tyrell Ventura.
I'm Tabitha Wallace.
I'm Sean Stone.
So Sean, you've been working very, very hard this last year on this documentary put together, A Century of War. We're going to air it this week starting November 15th, and it's going to air for the next 4 days straight, each section of it. What inspired you to embark on this documentary, and what's the general thesis?
Right. Well, really, I would say it started 10 years ago when I was at college in New Jersey at Princeton, but it's basically an hour outside of New York. So I used to take the train into the city and back and forth. And when you take the train, you go through New Jersey of what used to be a lot of that industrial hub of our country was centered around Jersey, and also New York also is a big manufacturing base. So it was amazing to take the train and see outside of it, also sometimes visiting places like Trenton, New Brunswick, and Newark. And you get to go in and see and realize, wait a minute, these buildings are decaying, they're falling apart. And we know it from our experiences in our other major cities, how like the roadways are falling apart. But you get this sense of, wait, what happened to the American century? And that was something that I was curious about at college, and seeing it firsthand on the East Coast, and then also, frankly, having this contradiction of what the professors would teach you. You'd study economics in college, and it's like, well, it's okay. We don't need industry because we've got service economy taking over. We just lost 300,000 jobs this quarter from our manufacturing sector. But hey, we replaced it with 300,000 service jobs at Walmart's. And we saw this transformation that was taking place 10 years ago, and I remember thinking, this can't sustain itself. It's not gonna work. And then we had the crash in 2008, 2009 with the mortgage markets, where people basically were saying, look, we are living in debt. We don't own these houses. We are basically living at the beneficence of the banks giving us loans, and so when that occurred, it finally gave us the opportunity to start reflecting, I think, and to be able to do a documentary like this, to say, let's actually take a look and say, America is supposed to be the greatest country in the world, and it's supposed to have this strongest economy in the world. But if it's only an economy that really benefits the 1% and the rentiers and the ones who actually own the houses that you live in, right, or that basically own the corporations that you work for, then it's not really the greatest. That's not inclusive. And we've seen the shrinking of the middle class. We've seen our generation, millennials, coming out of colleges, going into the workforce, realizing we just don't have the same wages that that our parents got in 1970. It's literally declined, real wages. So they replaced our wages with debt.
Yeah.
And these were the essential questions that I was trying to look at, and not say the century of war was only about militarism, but to say the century of war has been waged on us. Like we have bought in, the Americans have bought into this concept of projecting our power abroad, and we've forgotten this whole notion of, wait, we need to actually project our power internally through through investing in infrastructure, through protecting our manufacturing industrial base, through basically having a more balanced approach to the rest of the world than simply saying, well, we're here with our military and our guns blazing, and we're so wonderful. At the same time, people see those projections of power, and that's fearful. And then at the same time, at home, we see power in certain major cities like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, but then on the outskirts of these major cities, people are living in declining standards declining standards of living.
Yeah.
And that was a big issue that I would say sparked me on this journey.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Which is interesting because when you look at a lot of those, city neighborhoods that we've seen kind of crumble because manufacturing moved out, all these things moved out, they were middle class in the 50s and 60s. Even these, you see it in Baltimore and you see it in Los Angeles in certain areas of the city that have become these primarily minority communities. And it's just like, this is how it's always been. It wasn't. These places had, people owned the stores that they worked in, and now things are owned by someone else. It's not people from the community who own the corner store. They just rent it from somebody or their homes. And it's got to be hard to surprise any of us at this table after all the years and all of our experiences of doing this. What did you discover about putting this together that sort of surprised you the most about this country and about, where we come from?
Right. And you mentioned a lot of really good points that we talked about in the documentary, like Baltimore and how, the inner city of Baltimore is these tremendous brownstones that were from the middle class era 100 years ago, when it was a middle class community and it was thriving for African Americans living there at the time. Was the Renaissance basically in all the way through the 50s and 60s basically, and then it starts to crumble because you've lost your industrial base. You're not paying your laborers union wages. You've seen that. What happens as a result, you turn into a drug economy. You end up with rioting that goes on in places like Baltimore. We're seeing it all across the country now. Obviously, the rioting is not just in like a Baltimore or Detroit, but it's also going to Milwaukee, and it's who knows where.
You're seeing it on the plains of North Dakota right now, where you see people just fighting for clean drinking water and saying, hey, this is not right. The big oil and big business coming in and saying we're taking.
People are standing up.
Exactly, they are standing up, and so that's what's I think the real interesting is the contrast of how when you travel across the country and you really see the contrasts even within cities. I think it's always striking just to see like we are becoming like a third world country. And that's why, from traveling the world, you see that in third world countries, where you see like these centers of real wealth and prestige and power, and then you go a few miles down the road, and it's like everything is just crumbling, and the standards are really dropping off. And that's, I think, what's really was astounding, was going from city to city and just recognizing how we do have a tremendous wealth that's still here, but we're not putting our energy and our resources towards developing our future, prospects for 100 years from now. What is America going to look like? We're not thinking that way.
We're not thinking about quality of life.
No,
exactly.
And the quality of life is, as the late great George Carlin said, that we're deceived by our illusion of choice, that we can have 41 different flavors of cat food, but you only have like 2 political parties to choose from, or things like that. Right. And so it's very much kind of that illusion of like, oh, we have all these things we can purchase, but we really don't have many options at the end of the day. And speaking of a lot of different options, you were able to interview quite a vast majority of very different types of people, and from experts and so on. Who are some of the subjects that you talked to in this documentary, and do you how did you kind of go about picking them and that kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, obviously I wanted to give a perspective that's past, present, and future. So it's like we want to start with what is America's state currently, from the shrinking middle class, from the places like Detroit and Baltimore, and talking to people who are familiar with the economy in the current form and how it's been converted again from a notion of having wages, being able to buy your own house, to having to basically go into debt if you want to even go to school, let alone own a house. So we talked to a plethora of people. I think some of the most well-known would be like Nomi Prinz, who's a former Wall Street insider, also Catherine Austin Fitts, who's a former Wall Street insider, plus she was Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under George Bush Sr. So she's like political and economic insider who's got some great insights into basically how our communities have basically been taken over by Wall Street in a sense. Like even when she talking about community investing and how people are losing access to, not losing access, but let's say a lot of communities, and we have a great interview with the young guy from Detroit, right? And he's talking about how like he wants to help people inside their communities invest in their own communities because Wall Street is so far away. And it's like, how has Wall Street become such a power center for our country that we have to make all our investments into these massive international transcontinental corporations? And like what happened to community banking, community businesses? Like why can't you invest in your local, stores and companies and mom and pop shops? Like why there should be more markets and stock exchanges, frankly, and stock markets around these more local industries. So it gave me a lot of hope actually from these conversations that we've seen a decline, but we're giving ideas of things that we could do in future aside from the investment on the large scale infrastructure front, but just even with the local level of being able, because of technology, to reignite certain cities. So Detroit's getting more IT sectors coming in there. And I mean, we see it with like film and entertainment and how if we're translating our economy more to the digital space and to 3D printing, how we can actually there is a hope that we're going to be able to bring jobs back to America because we don't have to, deal with the supply chain going to China to construct things we can do with 3D printers here. Right. So actually there is like I would say there was a lot of things in the documentary that are actually very optimistic.
I was going to ask you how positive it is because there's so much. I think it's hard to get people sometimes to understand that there is hope. It's not all horrible. It's not the end of the world. Despite, that's something that politicians love to say, and it makes for good election talking points, and it gets people to the polls. Yeah. But in reality, there is hope, and it takes this much effort on the part of some people just letting go of a little bit of control and of people putting their money into places, like you said, in these smaller communities of local banks and being able to sort of invest in that in the future. Yeah,
there's hope on the community level. There's hope also when it comes to like energy, for example, trying to decentralize access to energy. We're already seeing it with solar and wind. We talk about also in the show, in the documentary, goes into basically certain prospects for nuclear fission and fusion energy, which is a larger scale. But we also even look at cold fusion, which many people have dismissed since '89 when they said, it's not real. Well, a lot of scientists, in particular at Stanford Research Institute, people like Michael McCubre, who's one of the energy directors there, he's very optimistic. He thinks that cold fusion is very realistic and it can allow for people to be able to power their homes with these cold fusion processes that don't require a lot of, they don't have any heat excursions. So it's a low energy nuclear reaction. So it's a very safe nuclear reaction that people can ultimately hope to be able to have at their home.
So having like a little mini nuclear reactor in my home.
Yeah, because it's considered a nuclear process. But again, like that's the thing about the documentaries. We get into this whole issue of like how people are afraid of nuclear, but actually we have to reassess everything in our body is oriented around nuclei, right? Because that's what atoms are. So it's like we oftentimes, I would say the science, technology-driven sector of our country has become so privatized that oftentimes we've been cut off from understanding how these things can actually still be applied to us on like the local scale and the home scale, and how we can actually still have a future that's going to be more physically science technology-driven rather than all
I played that
cyber
video game. Man. That video game was Fallout. It was interesting. No, I'm just.
I'm still playing that video.
We only got like about a minute left, but it was an incredible journey and a heavy undertaking that you took on to kind of do that in the show, and what do you very quickly? You only got about like a minute left. What do you hope that the audience will leave with after they're done watching your documentary over the next 4 days?
No, I think the takeaway is going to be obviously reflect upon the American century and the fact that it has not honored, I think it's agreement with most Americans. There's definitely the prospect of it, but we have to get political and talk about real issues, not just the slogans of presidential elections, so that no matter who becomes president next, the idea is watch the documentary and start to say, hey, where can we make the investments from the government sector into infrastructure to protect our industries? Where can we, as a private sector, look for support in terms of helping these markets to grow so that we can rebuild America? Because we have all this land, we have the resources, we have the people, we have education and skills available to us. So it's time for us to really make America great by reinvesting in our country and not always looking for foreign markets and basically military excursions abroad.
China.
Great point.
No
Like
China.
All right. As we go to break, Hawk Watchers, don't forget to let us know what you think of the topics we've covered on Facebook and Twitter. See our full shows at RT.com. And for exclusive behind-the-scenes Hawks coverage, download the app RT plugin, which is available on iTunes and Google Play. Coming up, Sean Stone talks the consequences of failed politics on the economy with the professor of political economy at Northeastern University, Barry Bluestone. Stay tuned to Watching the Hawks.
Here's what people have been saying about Redacted tonight.
Give it to us.
Redacted is full-on awesome. The only show I go out of my way to watch every week. It really packs a punch. Lee Camp is the John Oliver of RT America.
You guys do have the same accent.
Hey, we are apparently better than boobs.
Nothing's better than boobs.
You see, people you've never heard of love Redacted tonight. The president of the World Bank, though, hates it.
Well, he doesn't really have any taste.
Seriously, he sent us an email.
I'm Larry King, and you are watching RT America. Question more.
I'm Governor Jesse Ventura, and you're watching RT America. Question more.
I'm Tom Harpin, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture. We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
The secretive Trans-Pacific Partnership may never be signed into law by the United States, but it is merely the newest round in government trade agreements like GATT and NAFTA that have secured greater rights to transnational corporations, intellectual property, and assets without securing the businesses or skills of the American middle and working class. I sat down with the University of Northeastern economics professor Barry Bluestone for his take on these international trade agreements. I asked him if politicians have abdicated their responsibilities to their constituents by sending jobs overseas and not protecting Americans from the negative consequences of globalization and trade deals. Take a listen to his answer.
The abdication is because with free trade, we do get benefits. We create a lot of jobs because of more exports. We get some of our goods at lower prices so that people can afford them. The problem is that when you have that kind of wholesale shift and there are losers in the economy, you should find a way to compensate the losers. Sometimes that could have been done in terms of cash rewards, let's say to laid off auto workers who lost their jobs because of NAFTA. It could be also very important part of it would be retraining of workers so they could be trained for other high-skilled jobs. But we didn't do that. So kind of the majority of Americans who are not in manufacturing or in trade-affected industries gained from free trade. But there were hundreds of thousands who did not, and we should have done a better job of helping them get through this so that they would not be losers in this trade game.
Mm-hmm. And how much of a role do you think might investment in things like infrastructure do to provide, again, opportunities for employment in these sectors like manufacturing and to basically reignite the Rust Belt, for example, that's been left with all these jobs that have been turned over to many people turning to the welfare state or to low-paying service jobs instead of being employed?
Critical. I mean, we need infrastructure for primarily because our infrastructure is crumbling. Whatever city you're in, you're not driving very quickly through on our roads. We don't have enough mass transit. In many parts of the country where we have drought, we don't have enough water supplies. In other parts of the country, we have floods. So we need the infrastructure to make our country work better. But if we were to invest in that infrastructure, we would also be creating hundreds of thousands of jobs, if not in the long run, millions of jobs at good pay and we could train workers who might have lost their job in a steel mill or in an auto plant to work in those infrastructure industries. So that is where we need to see a lot of that investment. Unfortunately, we have a political situation in Washington now where it's almost impossible to get anything through. The Freedom Caucus in the House has stopped almost everything that Obama has wanted to do. We'll have to see what happens after the next election, assuming that Hillary Clinton is the next president of the United States, assuming that the United States Senate lands in Democratic hands. One would suspect that there will be a big push for infrastructure investment. She's talked about that. The question is, will the House go along with it? Will Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, if he's still Speaker of the House, be willing to find ways of having the Democrats and the more moderate Republicans work together to give us the kind of expanded infrastructure we'll need to put literally hundreds of thousands of workers to work in good jobs?
Mm-hmm. So would you say that ultimately you think Obama was genuine in his desire to help Main Street when he came into office, but ultimately he was prohibited by Congress from doing the kind of infrastructure investments and other things that would have helped more of the middle class?
Absolutely. I think he had some plans that would have created many jobs for people who had lost their jobs, but he was stymied by Congress. You know, we also have to realize that when Obama came into office, we were facing the worst recession since the Great Depression. We had an unemployment rate which was in double digits. And people sometimes forget that our unemployment rate is now down below 5%. We've created literally millions and millions of jobs under the Obama administration. But of course, there are still millions of people who need full-time jobs, who may be in part-time jobs or unemployed. And we need to find a way of raising the wages of those people who are at the bottom of the income distribution so that they can share in the prosperity of this country. We have a very rich country. The problem is that the benefits of that wealth are not being shared anywhere near equitably.
But what do you make then of agreements like the TPP, for example, and frankly, the GATT and the NAFTA there, before it, in terms of, are these ultimately benefiting America because they make for cheaper goods, but in the process of outsourcing, they are leading to lower wages and lower wage employment for most people?
Yeah. Freer trade, being able to take advantage of trade between countries, is generally a good thing. It's good, actually, for the United States. It's certainly good for our trading partners. I've been to many very low, wage, underdeveloped countries who are beginning to have something of a middle class because of our trade. The problem with it is that when we open up our borders to trade, there is a segment of our population who are harmed by that. In the past, it's been manufacturing, the steel industry, the auto industry, the rubber industry, and so forth. What we fail to do, and what we need to put into agreements like the TPP, and we fail to do it adequately in NAFTA, is to put in protections for those people who benefit, who have been hurt by it, and we can do it out of the benefits that we all get. It's estimated that, on average, Americans gained about $100 a year in extra spending power as a result of NAFTA. That's $100 a year, not a lot, but when you multiply that by all of the households in this country, it's billions and billions of dollars. We should have found a way of taking a little of that benefit, let's say $10 or $20 of that $100, and use that to benefit those who paid the price for free trade, those who worked hard in standard traditional industries but lost their jobs because of NAFTA. That was the failure, not that we moved toward free trade, but that we failed to compensate the losers. The reason why I am opposed to the current trade bill, and I think Hillary Clinton is as well, along with, I assume, Donald Trump, is that it doesn't have protections for the workers who will be harmed, although I believe in the long run the TPP, if it had those protections, would be good for all Americans.
Precisely, and I always have to ask you then, too, about Trump's slogan about making America great again. Do you think that ultimately speaks to a zeitgeist in America that is tired of this outsourcing and the Wall Street transnational corporate dominance, where they don't see the protection being provided by their politicians?
Absolutely. I mean, Donald Trump, given all his craziness, has still tapped into something real in the United States, and that is, particularly in the Midwest, where millions of workers lost their jobs over the last 20 or 30 years in good-paying, usually unionized jobs, they feel they've been left behind. That's particularly true of white workers who have not had a college education, who felt at one point they were solidly middle class, with a great deal of economic security, often because of good union contracts, and they feel left behind. I think the Democratic Party has too often seemed to be caring about other people than those folks in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Indiana. And I'm glad to see that we finally have some politicians who are talking about their issues, including John Lewis, a leader of the civil rights movement, a congressman from Georgia, who recently gave a talk here in Boston and said we have to worry about all workers, whatever color they are, whatever education they have, and we have to have programs to make sure they all benefit from the American economy.
And what do you make then of the overall power of the transnational corporations in the modern world? Do you think that it's something that should be, in a sense, it should be a concern, the way that in the past we've had laws against monopolies, and yet now we see these transnational corporations that literally are gobbling up, basically they're larger than most countries' GNP, some of these massive corporations. Is that a concern for us, and how do we basically find a balance, strike a balance between these transnational corporations that have so much wealth and power, and then, again, our American political democratic process?
Well, we've had periods of time in which we've really broken up these monstrous corporations, these huge corporations, the trust busting in the 1890s, and then again we did it through strong antitrust bills. But in recent times, we've allowed big banks to buy up other banks. We are now seeing AT&T trying to buy up Time Warner, making it, a mega communications corporation. I think we need to have much stronger regulations. I think we have to have much stronger antitrust policies. We also have to make it more difficult for American companies to go overseas to avoid taxes. I mean, part of our problem is that we have these huge corporations that are paying virtually no tax to the United States. They're looking for havens, safe havens, and we should say, look, if you want to go abroad, fine, but we're not going to let you sell anything in this country if you want to do it. I think we could use much stronger rules and regulations in the financial sector, but in all sectors of the economy where big corporations get too much control. I think the other problem is Citizens United. Basically, if you allow corporations to be treated as individuals and can spend as much to buy politicians as possible, you're going to have a society which increasingly becomes a plutocracy, not a democracy, but a country that is run by the rich. And I think we have to make sure that a future Supreme Court will take another look at Citizens United and reverse what I think was one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Professor Bluestone.
Glad to be with you.
And that is our show for you today. Remember, everyone, in this world, we are not told we are loved enough, so I tell you all, I love you. I am Tyrell Ventura.
I'm Tabitha Wallace.
And I'm Sean Stone.
Keep on watching the Hawks and have a great night, everybody.